Thanks for joining us today, guys. Today we're joined by Joe Bauer. He's got an exciting journey about fitness and life and how it took him from coast to coast and fitness space, real estate space. So excited for him to share a little bit about his perspective. Joe, you want to end introducing yourself to the audience?
Yeah, you bet, Liam. Thank you for having me on, first of all. So my name is Joe Bauer, and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, actually, where both of us are near right now, which is not all that normal for me. But kind of a weird background twist that I had. I grew up as a homeschooler way back when it was not cool. So my mom was in the education system and she raised my brother and sister. I on a 5-acre plot near Duval, Washington, if anybody knows that area at all. And then ended up going to public school and high school and played college baseball and junior college. Loved working out even more than I loved baseball. So I went on to get a kinesiology degree at San Diego State. But long story short, had personal training businesses in San Diego, Seattle, and even one in New York City when I had moved out there. And I felt like I was hitting the ceiling on my income at that particular time, but I still loved health and fitness. So I did some research and figured out that real estate should definitely be my next path of action to create wealth. So I started doing things like buying rental properties at the wrong time in like 2007, 8, 9. And that's a whole other story. Maybe we'll get into it later. But then continued my education, doing some fix and flips, some wholesales, and eventually moved back out to Seattle, where I decided it would be a great idea to try and get rid of the normal lifestyle, move into a Sprinter van. It is about, I don't know, 60 square feet or something like that with my then girlfriend, now wife. So we've learned that we can live in a small space together. And 4 years later, I decided that real estate should be put on hold a little bit so I could develop something called the Get Better Project, which is an online at home fitness program that we've used and developed through minimal equipment training in the van, as well as patting myself on the back. I trained my mom in the program, and she is now the fittest 65 plus CrossFitter in the world as of 2021. So anything you want to dive into there, I'd be happy to.
How do you quantify the fittest 65 plus year old person? What I guess metrics are used to deem someone fitter than someone else?
Yeah, so if anybody that's familiar with CrossFit will know that the CrossFit season has what they do in a worldwide open, which just actually happened last month. And you take anybody that wants to sign up for about 20 bucks and go through a group of workouts that are presented to you. Then they take the top 10% from there and give those guys a little bit harder workouts. And they take the top 10% from there, and then they give those guys a little bit harder workouts. And then they take the top 10 or 20 in the world, depending on that particular year. And you go to something called the CrossFit Games, and they put you through a week of massively grueling workouts that you sometimes know and sometimes don't know when you walk onto the floor. And at the end of that, they crown the fittest, or 1 through 20th fittest in the world. And it could be anything from like lifting really heavy weights to running a half marathon or longer. They did a row marathon a few years back, to just like gymnastics, whatever, swimming. They can throw whatever at you.
That's funny. That's pretty cool. So through these businesses, once you hit that point, right, and you were talking a little bit about the plateau, in your first endeavors of having the businesses, Seattle, San Diego, New York, and you started to generate, added income, right? You mentioned getting into real estate eventually. What did what was your framework for how you invested your, added profit? Where did you put it
Yeah.
and why?
Well, unfortunately to me, I make all the mistakes in the book and try and learn from them. And hopefully I'm doing that at a slow pace. So hopefully people listening can just bypass my mistakes. But I was making pretty good money being one of those like executive trainers in New York City. And I decided to move into real estate. So I invested my money in buy and hold real estate at the time, which seemed like a really good idea. And, hindsight's 2020, and there's things that I would have definitely changed. But I had 4 units that had easily or early bought in early on, and those were cash flowing really nicely. But then the downturn hit in the 2008, 2009 real estate market, which has been one of the worst if you follow real estate at all in, the last, I don't know, 30 years or something like that. And ended up losing those guys to foreclosure, which is at the time really sucked. But now I look back, I'm like, wow, I learned a whole bunch from that super fun mistake. And what I learned from it mostly was that the location that I was buying those properties in was not suitable for a long-term Joe, if you will, because I was eventually going to move back to the West Coast, and I should have thought about that in my happiness level living in New York City, which was not a perfect fit for me. But I was so interested in moving quickly into making myself successful in real estate that I made some moves that were probably too fast rather than thinking about it and investing that money elsewhere. And now I'm back in health and fitness. So if that tells you anything.
If you had, so you talked a little bit about the location, spending more time, making sure you get the buy side right.
Yeah.
Are there any things you would have done in terms of, setting reserves or having, and would that have been enough to bridge you through the gap, right? Like, so, if you bought them, great.
Yeah.
Was there anything you could have done that would bridge you through the gap where you would still own them today?
Oh, absolutely. And the truth is that I would have probably still owned them, but I had decided that I really wasn't happy in New York City, and I moved back to Seattle, and I needed to pick myself back up. So I had a nice nest egg and I had the properties, but then the downturn hit at that same time when I wasn't bringing in income and kind of trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And those perfect storm, if you will, hit me at a time when if I just had that, even half of that personal training income still, I could have bridged the gap really easily. It wasn't, I was kind of having my early midlife crisis of not knowing what to do next at that point, unfortunately.
So it sounds like you wound down the personal training business in its entirety and went 100% into real estate.
Correct. Yeah. I decided that I didn't understand business at all at that point. And I was just like, all right, I need to be working and like sitting here looking at you, moving as a personal trainer. And I didn't understand any other way of doing that. I hadn't, I'd thought about online stuff at that point, but it wasn't developed enough to really understand how I would make money doing it. And my just mindset was really small at the time. So I was thinking I needed to jump to something else. And real estate made sense to me in the fact that, all right, I can buy something that's going to bring me cash flow, or I can, hire a team or partner with somebody, which I eventually did. I partnered with someone that was really good at real estate, and I developed my marketing skills. So we partnered and then did a whole bunch of marketing, usually direct mail, online, Google AdWords, something like that. And then brought in a whole bunch of leads, and then she would handle those leads. And it worked out really nicely for a while to do lots of some fix and flips and wholesales and listings. And that worked well for about 8 years or so. And like I said, before the podcast, looking back now, again, hindsight's 2020, I wish I would have just held all of those. And now I would have, 30 or 40 or more rental properties, but here we are.
As you look back, obviously hindsight 2020, we talked a little bit about you, foraying into real estate again and looking for properties. What's the learning and what are you looking for as you're looking for your properties now, right? Obviously, well, you're continuing the business, right? In terms of being mobile and, putting lifestyle first. So how does that affect what that means for you and your investment portfolio and where you're looking to put those dollars?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've just educated myself a lot more in how to get how to get loans that are going to be suitable for cash flow and more long-term hold. I'm not a big advocate right now or actually I should step back and say, now that my Get Better Project online coaching business produces enough money to live off of, it makes it much easier for me to not have to do transactional real estate in order to maintain my lifestyle. So when we're looking at these properties, it's like, all right, we've got, $20,000 or $40,000 that are saved in the bank, and we can put that into something that's going to cash flow or at least bring money back into our lives or our businesses. And at this point, because both my wife and I are working and doing well, we don't need to have that money roll into our lifestyle. So we will be able to just roll it back into more real estate. And I'm looking, like, to answer your question, financing first part, and then figuring out just education on the rental side of things, whether it be long-term or short-term Airbnb style stuff, because it seems to be pretty interesting in most of the areas that we are trying to buy right now. And I say trying because real estate market is really interesting.
Is there an asset class or location or something that you're attracted to that, you think works, right? Like what, and how did you get there? As obviously you've got a lot of background in, wholesaling and fix and flip, right? And so, for some of the audience who might be thinking about, diving into real estate, right? Like from the expert's mouth, what, where would you, give advice or point them in a direction?
So first of all, what we're looking for is areas that we really like to spend our time personally. So we've got some places in like southern Idaho and in western Colorado that we really like, that we're looking at as far as things that would work for long-term and short-term rental properties. But then definitely always looking for 2 to 4 family rental properties, because you can qualify for personal financing on those particular units. You don't need commercial loans. And if you really want to, you can, let's say, buy a 2 or 4 family and use one of those where you live in it for a certain amount of time, get preferential treatment on the financing, and then convert it into a full rental property. Or some of these places that we like to go a lot, our strategy is going to be to have one of the units be an Airbnb that we can dip in and out of as much as we want to, because there are definitely advantages there are advantages you can figure out via software that is available to you to see what kind of income Airbnbs are making in particular areas for very low amount of like cost of entry, if you will.
That's AirDNA, I imagine, is one of those.
Yeah.
I imagine winter in a Sprinter van in Colorado would be nicer to have a pad to crash in.
It would. We had -20 a couple of days this winter, so it gets cold. Yeah, for sure.
That's intense. As you think about growing your business, right? Obviously, you've transitioned your training business from a one-to-one to a one-to-many.
Yes.
And that's growing. How do you determine how much you put into your business and to continue to grow that, right? Versus putting in real estate or putting in savings or whatever that may be?
Yeah, it's a great question. Most of the time it is, and at this particular time in the Get Better project, we are trying to put 50% of our income into marketing dollars to just try and grow it as much as possible. And that's because I am still at a point where I've minimized lifestyle expenses and don't need, it's kind of funny to say, like, everybody's different as far as lifestyle expenses go, right? And everybody has different situations. We've minimized ours to the point where the amount of income that I need to bring in for myself, because we have a completely paid off lifestyle and we're just paid for food basically and camping at other times, I can put a lot more back into the business. And actually, 2 months ago, I stopped the advertising dollars to do a refit with a story brand expert. So we're just getting ready to launch that. So yeah, I try and do 50%.
That number ever going to change, right? Like I imagine at a certain point, you don't see the benefit of, continuing to put 50% as that number gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So is there any strategic framework that you've got in terms of like, hey, this makes sense up until a certain point, and then from there, I'm starting to plan for kids or think for the future or whatever that may be?
Yeah, and right now the problems or things that I'm thinking about as far as putting that much money in are hiring other coaches in order to handle the clients that come in. And that means for things like we do something that I feel like is unique in the industry, where we have unlimited hands-on coaching. So like from an online perspective, so you could reach out to your coach and you get video reviews, you get nutrition, like one-off, like, hey, I took a picture of what I'm eating at dinner, what should, or the menu, what should I order based off of my macros that you've set up for me. So that can take some hands-on approach as far as like figuring out how much to limit or just let that coach go, if that makes sense. And if I'm paying them from an hourly perspective, it's trying to manage that box of like, all right, I want you to give them as much support as they need. But if you've got one person that's just like taking a ton of your time and my budget, then how do we put parameters on that?
I imagine that goes into some sort of pricing strategy, right? You've got unlimited today, but you got to find a way to, came from the wireless industry, right?
Yeah.
How do you tether or reduce, right? The bandwidth for some to make sure that everyone, has a good experience.
Yep, absolutely. And the truth of the matter is that I'm trying to deal with this because some people, actually, most people don't require that. And most people hardly ask for anything. So as of right now, it's just coming up as like, all right, well, there's, you've got a couple of people that are monetizing all of your time. How should we handle that? And should, like you said, should there be some sort of boundary there? I don't know.
On
The
business
question.
challenges, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, as you look back, what would one piece of advice you would give to, some of the listeners who are thinking about, where to invest, how to invest, from your experience? Would it be real estate? Is there something else? And, how to get started?
So if I had to talk to my, 20-year-old self and give them advice, I would just say invest in things that you find passion in. And maybe if it's different than what everybody is telling you, that's okay. At least make sure that you explore that fully, because if I would have told myself that now, I would have continued to develop that personal training business and find avenues of making money in that arena, and then put it into real estate, but not be a full-time real estate investor, if that makes sense. Because it's really easy, at least these days, to figure out how to invest in some real estate, and that's a great way of holding money. And not to say that all of our money goes to real estate, but it's just one part of an investing portfolio that I believe, I would say that we're like 75% real estate, 25% stock, something like that. But like having a wide variety and then investing in all kinds of things. But that passion thing, I keep going back to that. I'm like, man, I wish I would have just kept following my passion instead of having to make these changes, because that's what really fuels me when I get up in the morning, and keeps me up at night when I'm trying to go to bed, and just in a good way, right? In a good way.
For sure, right? It aligns purpose and intent, right, with everything you're doing, right? So it becomes much clearer, much more aligned, much better place to be. As we're wrapping up here, Joe, right? What's the best way for our audience to connect back with you?
Yeah, so anything The Get Better Project is where you can find me, where you can get information on coaching stuff, where you can reach out. So like Joe at The Get Better Project, thegetbetterproject.com, The Get Better Project on Instagram, kind of a thing. And I'm happy. Like I said, this is my passion project. So meaning that I don't care if people reach out and ask questions. I do not mind at all. I'm not going to be like, that's cost you $100. I believe that if I give away as much as I can, then it always comes back around, and it always has. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And it could be for real estate too.
Awesome. Well, appreciate your time today, Joe, and love the conversation.
Thanks, Liam.